In relation to the connection between people experiencing intersecting inequalities and experiencing homelessness and housing precarity, the background and the rationale for researching this topic provided in the introduction demonstrates that there is a correlation between women and BAME communities and the private rented accommodation, low-paying occupations, dependency on financial governmental support and high levels of invulnerability to homelessness and housing insecurity. The research presented in this dissertation highlighted that negative trends associated with the insecurity of the UK's housing landscape, such as declining levels of homeownership, dependency of a large proportion of low-income households on the UC system and the significant levels of residency in social and privately rented accommodation, is experienced disproportionately by women and BAME community members, in comparison to the majority population. When addressing how homelessness and housing insecurity have been politically and theoretically viewed in the past and in the current climate, the literature reviewed highlighted that in the past, there was a tendency to believe that homelessness was a result of poor life choices of dysfunctional or deviant individuals, and this stigmatization is still present in the UK society. The findings of the dissertation have demonstrated that an intersectional lens can potentially radically improve UK homelessness and housing insecurity policy. These findings are important for future policy and practices, as the issues of homelessness and housing insecurity are not seen as gendered or racialized problems by the UK government, which simply exacerbates the deprivation and stigmatization faced by homeless women and BAME people. The findings of this dissertation have the ability to influence the field as they bring further attention to the importance of identity and intersecting inequalities in connection with housing inequality in the UK. Income inequality is rising in the UK, and if supportive and preventative measures are not put in place, the current situation will be exacerbated, more households will face housing insecurity, and the costs of welfare provision will continue to increase. Understanding the disproportionate impacts on those with intersectional identities needs to become central to policies that address homelessness and housing insecurity, which potentially may lead to inclusive, multi-access policies that ensure the fair treatment of all social groups and genders in such a way to support the most vulnerable. From conducting this research project into how far an intersectional lens improves policies towards homelessness and housing insecurity in the UK, the following recommendations are made for areas of focus for policy reform and future policy creation. Firstly, it is recommended that the UK government works with organisations that have conducted research into the disadvantageous impacts of UC and the benefit cap on women and BAME individuals. This can aid in reforming the benefits system so that the needs of all genders and social groups are met fairly, and the financial support provided can positively impact claimant situations. Secondly, the short-term, quick-fix strategies towards UK homelessness and housing precarity need to be replaced by long-term measures that keep people out of homelessness and provide long-term security. A reduction in temporary accommodation and shelters needs to occur, being replaced with locally based prevention services. Concluded that congregate shelters are costly and ineffective, whereas increasing support provision, is effective and cost offsets may occur. The costs of shelters can be reinvested into the revitalization of support services, as well as the social housing sector. Notwithstanding the gains made by Finland, it should also be acknowledged that there are important differences between the UK and Finland's housing, population and public services landscape. In relation to the efforts of the Finnish government in increasing the availability, affordability and adequacy of Finland's social housing stock, social housing accounts for a significant proportion of Finland's total housing stock. This differs considerably from the housing landscape of the UK. After the Second World War, large-scale public investment massively increased the social housing sector, but the 1980s saw a large percentage of social housing being sold off to raise government funds in times of austerity. The Right to Buy scheme allowed social housing tenants to purchase their home at a heavily discounted price. And the profits raised by this scheme were not used in the replacement of the housing that was sold since then. Levels of the construction of social housing have decreased due to grants from the central government falling from 39% to 14%. Such differences between the UK's and Finland's social housing sector offers a challenge towards the implementation of the FHS into UK housing policy, as a much higher amount of social housing is needed to support people in the UK experiencing homelessness or housing precarity. For centuries, boys were top of the class. But these days, that's no longer the case. A new study by the OECD, a club of mostly rich countries, examined how 15-year-old boys and girls performed at reading, mathematics, and science. Boys still score somewhat better at maths, and in science the genders are roughly equal. But when it comes to the students who really struggle, the difference is stark. Boys are 50% more likely than girls to fall short of basic standards in all three areas. Researchers suggest that doing homework set by teachers is linked to better performance in maths, reading, and science. Boys, it appears, spend more of their free time in the virtual world. They are 17% more likely than girls to play collaborative online games than girls every day. They also use the internet more. Third, peer pressure plays a role. A lot of boys decide early on that they are just too cool for school, which means they're more likely to be rowdy in class. Teachers mark them down for this. In anonymous tests, boys perform better. In fact, the gender gap in reading drops by a third when teachers don't know the gender of the pupil they are marking. So what can be done to close this gap? Getting boys to do more homework and cut down on screen time would help. But most of all, abandoning gender stereotypes would benefit all students. Boys in countries with the best schools read much better than girls. And girls in Shanghai excel in mathematics. They outperform boys from anywhere else in the world.